Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 124 today to talk about one of my favorite topics, something certainly that our listeners know I'm very passionate about and involved in, that is medical cannabis. And I am very excited to be joined by our host today because she's probably the reason, she may not know this yet, but we'll get into this, why I'm even involved in this space, and it's because of her daughter's story. We're talking to Paige Figi, who is the executive director of a group called Coalition for Access Now. We're going to talk about what that is and what Paige's story is. Paige, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Connor. I didn't know that. That was your origin of your story, so I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, no, it's these stories have been very impactful. So I want our listeners first to learn about them. I came across you and Charlotte in a documentary put on by CNN called Weed, and the host was Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who's kind of the resident medical expert for CNN. Will you share us a little bit about your daughter's story, and then I'd like to kind of unpack a little bit more of that and kind of tie in my experience with it as well.
Sure, of course. So I think they're doing 7 of these documentaries called Weed. I think they're on 4 or 5 now. So way back 7 years ago, Charlotte has epilepsy. She was 5 years old. We had reached the end of the line of treatments, and we had brought her home, signed a do not resuscitate, put her in home hospice. We had no drugs left to try. So her seizures back then she was having a seizure every half hour, from my memory, and sometimes more. That was sort of like that average day. These are tonic-clonic or grand mal massive seizures. Most of her seizures were even longer than, were considered status, were 20 minutes long. So she had very few conscious minutes and, really, she had lost all life skills. She couldn't swallow. She couldn't talk. She couldn't breathe room oxygen, and she couldn't, feed herself. So she was basically just sort of like a catatonic 5-year-old. And we just, I don't want to say we gave up, but the doctors, there's just nothing left. There's only so many treatments for certain medical disorders, and we had tried them all. Mm-hmm. And she was resistant to all of them. So I lived in Colorado, and I started looking at cannabis for comfort, THC and that sort of thing, just for a comfort measure. Mm-hmm. We thought she had maybe a couple months left to live. It was pretty grim. And at the time I was learning that there'd never been a child this young allowed a medical marijuana card. I was a military wife. I was a Republican military wife and a conservative family. And so it was a stretch for me to even want to try that. But,
right.
But it was, it's pretty controversial back then, especially for a dying child. So I went ahead and got her a red card, and that, that's a whole story in itself, with the doctors all speaking to the state medical marijuana division and everyone, discussing, is this going to be appropriate? And it was legal, but I needed many approvals to do this. Mm-hmm. At the time, this really wasn't about cannabidiol or CBD. This was just about trying to make her comfortable. She was absolutely that 10 to 20 lucid minutes per hour was absolutely, a struggle for her, and pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. And so in my quest to try and use cannabis for this child, and again, she was like a baby. She was like a newborn, very sick baby. I found information in other countries that there was a component of the plant that was potentially an anti-convulsant. Now it's what we know now as CBD or cannabidiol, but there just wasn't a lot of information. To say there wasn't a lot of information is sort of an understatement. There was no information. We didn't call it CBD. Right. I was calling other countries with translators on the telephone to just gain any information. As a parent, you have to, I don't know, I knew she was going to die, and I had to live with myself after, and I had to, live with the fact, did I chase everything down and look under every lid and make sure, so I didn't have that guilt, that survivor's guilt. Sure. After she passed. And so I started looking into this. To make this whole long story, because each little part of this story is a whole novel in itself. But I came across some people breeding a hemp with cannabis, with medical cannabis, to get the concentration of CBD very, very high and the concentration of THC, that's the part that is known for the psychoactive effect of the high, to get that part very low. So it was essentially high CBD THC I was looking for. It took forever. It took thousands and thousands of dollars and thousands of phone calls, and I gave up. And then I met a person who was breeding a plant just like exactly what I was looking for. It was a miracle. It was a miracle. It was one of those moments in your life that's absolutely why we have that word miracle. And that was the Stanley brothers. That was Joel Stanley. And they had no real, they didn't have a use for the plant. It was just curiosity. And so I asked him to consider helping me at a time when everyone was leaving this kid's life. She was terrifying to treat medically. He came in and agreed to do this, and we kind of kept it quiet. And we made an oil, an extract from this high CBD plant. He named it Charlotte's Web. We didn't know it was going to work at the time. And we gave it to her. I had to give it to her in her feeding tube. I wrote a little mini clinical trial. This wasn't just, she's not inhaling, just vaping this. Not that there's anything wrong with that. This was pretty scientific as we could, with what information we had and with the laws, as scientific as I could. I did it just like every other drug I've given to her, and was very conservative. And I had certain parameters that had to be met. And we did it this way, and she stopped seizing. She stopped seizing from her first dose. She went a week without a seizure from that first dose, and I was giving it a couple times a day, 3 times a day back then. And so it was like, and everyone says, well, how did that feel? And, I didn't believe it was working. These drugs the stuff that we give these people are to stop seizures completely shut your brain function down, and we would put her in induced comas, put her on a ventilator, and we'd open her eyelids and her eyes would still be seizing, and her body's, completely unconscious. So these are powerful drugs, and it was just hard to sort of believe that this plant, not only cannabis, but because it's a powerful plant, but the cannabis we were using didn't even get her high at all. Right. So it was just sort of confounding that this plant, this herbal supplement, this like vitamin I was giving her stopped her seizure. So I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it until we saw about 100 people with a similar story. And that's how, solidified in my head it was that this wasn't going away. She was going to die of this. There's no way to treat it. And here we found this, this treatment for her. I don't want to say she's recovered from her epilepsy, but she certainly had a massive response and still takes Charlotte's Web. 7 years later, she's on no other drugs. She was weaned from her last drug right when I began this many, many years ago. She hasn't been in the hospital. So her seizures remain resolved. Wow. And that's the story that Sanjay Gupta and we told. It took 18 months to decide to go public. I felt it wasn't responsible to put this out there, especially on such a large, a network that CNN had, and not have answers and not have some more science for people and not have a product for people. Sure. I just felt that wasn't right. And of course, the story goes that people just started moving here to Colorado instantly. I mean, I have a family I'm friends with still that packed up that weekend that aired on Sunday night. That Weed One aired. They just packed up and moved here. I just really didn't. I don't think we could have predicted how many people were in the same situation. You sort of become in your own little hole of hell with whatever you're going through, and it turns out a lot of people wanted another option to treat. Well,
it's hope for a lot of people, right? I mean, people that to your point, maybe you don't know they're out there, but they certainly know they're out there. Now they can relate to you and Charlotte with their experience, and I can imagine that would be extremely motivating after, I got to know a lot of these families too with Dravet syndrome and epilepsy, and you exhaust all these options, and the medical options that you use have, profound side effects, as you say, having to put a kid in a coma just for some relief and so forth. And so it's not like the conventional treatments aren't without their dangerous and negative side effects. And so when your report came on, I imagine that was just a breath of fresh air for so many of these people. Give us a little snapshot of how Charlotte's doing today. For those who haven't seen the documentary, I'm going to link to it on the show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/124, so that they can learn more about Charlotte. But for those who have seen the documentary, What is she? How is she doing today? You say the seizures. She's still using the medicine. What has the years of not having the seizures done for her general improvement?
So the seizures are she still has epilepsy. She still has special needs. She has brain damage. This is a negative stuff. She has brain damage from the medicine, from certain medications she's tried, they believe, is what caused her problems. But her seizures are like 99.9% resolved. She just has a couple a month. They're in her sleep, usually nocturnal. They resolve on their own, so they're not 4 hours long. She hasn't been to the hospital for epilepsy. We removed her feeding tube permanently. She's not on oxygen, so she's non-medical is how I explain it. She can walk and talk and eat. She went to school for a little bit. I homeschool my children, but we thought it would be nice to try. I think it would have been, it was fun for her to ride the bus and
sure.
be with other kids. So she actually went to school and she rides a bike. Her only problem now is is that she has bone density problems, oddly, is a side effect of these drugs that you use in infancy. It weakens their bones. So she falls down and breaks her femur, and that was happening in school. So she's back to homeschooled, and she's great. I mean, it's a manageable situation. She has epilepsy, and it's just absolutely, it's hard to find the words to explain what our life was like before. It was just absolutely, it was grim. Like I said, it was just a grim, depressing situation. And now it's very, very different. I have a lot of gratefulness in me for having 7 more years with her, for having her healthy and for hear her laugh and talk. So it's easy. It's good. It's totally different life right now.
That's amazing. Well, and so what we were doing here in Utah at the time was we had convened this group of industry folks and advocates to actually try and legalize industrial hemp. We thought, hey, look, conservative Utah, there's no way they're going to allow this for medical, let alone recreational, but let's open the door with industrial hemp. So we started meeting with folks, potential investors who wanted to grow this stuff. And right then, as we were having these meetings, is when Weed, the #1, the documentary came out. And I watched this and was just so moved by Charlotte's story that my question at the time was, well, who else, who like Charlotte is in Utah that has Dravet syndrome? And so we found the Epilepsy Association of Utah. We found Jennifer and Stockton May. Stockton at the time, I believe it was 9 or 10, just like Charlotte, had Dravet syndrome, horrible seizures. They had exhausted every option possible. So they were very gracious enough to allow us to interview them and share their story. And in doing so, it was hilarious because as soon as we published the article, it had some photos of the May family and featured their story. And I had every TV, radio, newspaper outlet calling me within hours across the board, everybody in the state saying, get us this woman's contact information, this mom. We want to talk to her. And, of course, at the time, this was 5 years ago, 2013. And you can imagine here in Utah, largely Mormon, socially conservative community. And the headlines, wrote themselves, right? Mormon mom becomes medical marijuana advocate. And this was so outside the norm for Utah at the time that was the sexy headline for everybody, which, of course, brought all the media attention, which shared the plight, the sympathetic story, which led to the, political reform effort. And that's where I want to ask you the next question, Paige, is at the time when you realized that this was helping Charlotte, you were fortunate enough to be in a state that it was already a few steps ahead in terms of legalizing access to this cannabis plant. What were your thoughts then, and what are your thoughts now that here you see, as you put it, this miracle, this wonderful medicinal opportunity that doesn't have all the side effects? What are your thoughts about this dichotomy between the amazing thing that you've seen this plant be able to do and the laws around the country that often prohibit access for those who actually need it? What are your thoughts on kind of that injustice, if you agree with that word? How do you feel about that?
Right. And that's exactly, it does. It feels like a human rights issue. It feels like we're not asking, and Utah was the first state, if I'm correct, and to do this, to do the first
CBD.
To do like a CBD bill. And you were kind of vilified also for it. It wasn't enough, and you weren't helping all the medical marijuana patients, which the law obviously is different now this week. And congratulations, Utah. But I was certainly part of that too, vilified for for going back. And just to back up, those people that were coming here, these medical refugees, as the media called them, I was then, because Charlotte was better, able to go back and help some of these states. And not that they couldn't do it on their own, but it was nice for those state legislative bodies to have a story, like a success story, and see, is someone come from a successful state. And we didn't have a hemp law, and we didn't have recreational back then. It was just Colorado was a medical marijuana situation. And so to go in and say, you don't have to have a Colorado with dispensaries, and the sky hasn't fallen that we have a medical marijuana law. You can do it however you want. And these states rapidly, starting with Utah, we're like, yeah, and they were Republican states, the South. And so it was nice to see the speed at which they were willing to do reform work. It was a little also in the same way maddening, and that it wasn't faster. State reform happens pretty quick, as you know. And then it was like, okay, well, let's do this federally. Once we sort of reached a tipping point, it was like, well, the federal government needs to get involved, because the federal law, and that there's the dichotomy between federal and state law. And until federal law is changed and CBD is descheduled, it doesn't matter what you do in each state. You have to protect the patient. So hemp is great, and hemp farming and ag bills are terrific. But no one was really out there protecting the consumer, the customer. If you're drug tested, if you're taking this and you work for the government, if you're in the military and you want to take CBD on a military base, if you go to school, if you go to the hospital, anything federally funded, if you want to bank. So while we have to protect the industry to allow for competition, and to allow these companies to responsibly start producing CBD oils, we have to protect the people buying it and the patients as well. And so anyway, all these states came on board, and no two states had the same thing. And then the federal government said, we're gonna do this too. We're gonna deschedule CBD, and that's what I've been working on. So yeah, it's encouraging to see people care, especially Republicans, especially anti-cannabis. People who've harped on against this plant for their careers, who've ran and campaigned and were elected on anti-cannabis platforms. It was encouraging to see them get on board and listen to these parents and patients and say, okay, we're going to help out. We're going to do something to help out. So it's a little bit of both.
Well, it's also encouraging to see Jeff Sessions is no longer at his post, and so maybe that will open up a door too as well. Talk to us a little bit, Paige, about now what you're doing with Coalition for Access Now. I can only imagine that a parent in your situation who has this firsthand experience, not only with Charlotte, but then as kind of this torchbearer, as you point out, so many families coming to you and other state reform advocates coming to you. You have kind of a front row seat into this entire situation, this movement. And so talk to us about how you've kind of parlayed that into Coalition for Access Now, what your goals are, and what kind of work you're doing today.
Well, so I don't, and I never have worked on the profit side. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just think that should be left to people who are good at farming and cultivating and manufacturing CBD oil. But I helped start the Charlotte's Web is the one company, and that's what we use, and we've always used. We started a nonprofit that Heather Jackson runs, which is a Realm of Caring, and they do research, and they do fundraising, and they just help with information about CBD, different companies, people who want more information, and they tally a lot of the disorders that people are using it for, and they collect information. And then I left all of that and started a nonprofit in Washington, and that is to pass a federal bill I just felt, like you said, I'm in the middle of it. I'm here. I mean, most of these refugee families lived in my house at some point, at least the first ones. They lived here and stayed with me to get on their feet here in Colorado. It's just an unbelievable situation when we first got into this. It really still is. And so I just felt responsible, like I had to go and continue the work and change this federally. And it's not a baby step. It's a one and done. This compound should not be lumped in with the entire plant. This should be regulated as a dietary supplement. CBD should be federally. And then that would it's not a free for all. So that would just line up with only the states that have passed a CBD bill, which is almost all of us now. But, for the states that are worried and don't want to deal with this, it doesn't go into effect for them. They're not going to have hemp farming until they pass their own state laws. But it does need to be separated from the plant and from the recreational argument. This is not what that is.
Now, obviously, there's been a lot of effort over the years to try and reschedule or even deschedule cannabis as a whole. And so do you perceive that your strategy right now is kind of the same with, I mean, let's use my own state, right? It's extremely unlikely here in Utah that we would have gotten this broad medical cannabis program passed had the legislature and the public not first become comfortable with that toe in the water, which was CBD and folks with epilepsy. It was a very comfortable and low barrier way to initiate the conversation, to start the education, and really to have a sympathetic face to put forward to broaden people's, comfort level, basically, with cannabis more generally. Do you perceive your strategy as at all being the same, where you're looking to deschedule CBD? The critic might say, or even not so much the critic, the medical cannabis advocate will say, well, why just CBD at this point? There's 2/3 of states now have broad medical cannabis programs. We just need to fight to reschedule or deschedule cannabis completely. And they might maybe vilify you, much like they did years ago with these CBD-only programs. How do you respond to your effort right now to still focus just on CBD when we have so many medical cannabis programs coming online throughout the nation?
So when I'll go to Utah, when you were in Utah and you were in those CBD bill meetings with your legislation, I don't imagine that they came on board because you said this is going to be the slippery slope, and this is the first step to, camel's nose under the tent, and this is the slippery slope down to recreational cannabis eventually is what we want in Utah. I don't imagine you got what you wanted by telling them that. And I know your legislators. We have 3 on the federal bills. We have Mike Lee and Orrin Hatch were large leaders on the Senate bill. And they are not going to legalize recreational marijuana federally. And it isn't that I'm deceiving them. There are plenty of bills to deschedule. Bernie Sanders I just think it's good to just do it all in one and not have baby steps, and DC work slow. And that's how it works. It's a slow process. It's different than state work. But I never went into this with, looking for like a 40-year plan of little baby steps. This is CBD descheduling and it's done. And there are plenty of people working on cannabis reform. And I just feel ethically that it's wrong, knowing what I know and talking, intimately, personally with these meetings in D.C. with these senators and representatives. They have no intention to do anything, some of them, to do anything with cannabis reform. Not this year, not next session. Republicans, people we need. This was a Republican. Right now, it's still a Republican Congress, and you need everybody to agree. You need a big bipartisan bill. And so in these meetings, they said, I have absolutely no intention of doing this. Why should we hold people who want CBD hostage waiting for a Bernie Sanders descheduling bill with one name on the bill for years? It's been sitting there for years with one name on the bill. I think they can work on those bills, and we can have this right now today. It can be a super urgent thing, as we've seen with how many people came on the CBD descheduling bill so quickly, and completely bipartisan, completely Republican-led and bipartisan bills. So I feel like it's wrong to make people wait and die. And there are kids that are dying waiting for this because their state hasn't legalized CBD yet, and they can't move. And so I just think that's crazy. I don't think that has to even be an argument. We can do it all. We can do both. This is what I have chosen to work on. I think this can be done really quickly. And if there wasn't infighting and vilification about me and doing this, I think it would be done already.
Paige, there's definitely power in story and the ability to kind of emotionally connect with the other person, set aside the academic, the irrational, the fear-mongering, and so forth. How essential is Charlotte's story and transformation to your quest? Is her story really, as I perceive it to be, something that can really drive changing opinion and increasing sympathy? How has her story kind of benefited advocacy work more generally, would you say?
I think it was the children. Of course, Charlotte was one kid, and now there's thousands and thousands of these people, patients, adults, Charlottes. There's thousands of them, maybe hundreds of thousands, millions probably. I think it just changed the dialogue because she was a very sick, innocent, helpless child. And it wasn't, we weren't talking about teen use. We weren't talking about the THC. And I think that's what changed things, that there are potential. This really could be medical. I think the people who doubt that cannabis can be medical were forced to talk about this with a child, and with seizures, with epilepsy in particular. It's very measurable. You can very clearly see the result when you start using this versus a cancer cell or somebody who has a more not as visible of a disorder. It's harder to see if it's working, if this is a functioning treatment. So with Charlotte, it was like, hundreds and hundreds of seizures a week down to none. And it was very clear. And so I just think that her age had something to do with it, and her helplessness. She was completely catatonic. So I think that changed it. No one ever imagined it was going to be. I never imagined it was going to have this effect. This wasn't a pre-planned thing. I'm just a mom. I wanted to help my kid. I didn't want to watch her die. And if she did die, I didn't want her to be uncomfortable. That's it. That's all it was. I'm not a social justice warrior. I'm not trying to change the world or stir up controversy. I really was just trying to help my kid. And then it was like, oh, there's other people who want this. I'm going to help them too, because if I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. I want nice and easy. I just want to help people, and people spin this however they want, but that's all it was, and that's all it still is. And I just want to make things easier for people who can't make things easier for themselves, or who just have it so bad that they can't go up and fight. I am able and willing to do that. And it sounds like you are as well. And a lot of our legislators are as well. We just have to find them.
Well, it's an amazing testament to not only, based on that story, be able to affect change, but someone in your position, as you point out, where you recognize that you have a unique skill set and, combination of experiences that have put you in a position where you can affect change, and you can broadcast that story, and you can make a difference. And so kudos to you for not sitting on your laurels and being content that you got what you need, but going out and trying to change the world for the better on behalf of other people. Paige Figi, amazing story. She's the executive director of Coalition for Access Now. We will link to Charlotte's story, the website. I'm also going to link to the interview I mentioned that we did here in Utah, so you can see a story other than Charlotte's that had an impact, and give you, the listener, an idea of potentially people in your community who you can connect with and help try and change the laws in your state if, in fact, that injustice, that human rights violation persists in your communities. Paige, thanks very much for joining us on Society in the State.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you so much for all your hard work, too.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.